Good afternoon. I'm Kevin Crilly, Executive Director of Gift Planning. I want to welcome you to the 29th annual Benjamin Ide. I did a check. They're really rolling along here. I don't want to waste a lot of time on introductions. I just want to welcome you because we've got a really fine lecture this afternoon for you, followed by our tea. And so I want to introduce him because I know he's got a lot of important information to share, and I can't think of anything more timely considering the political season and the discussion, not the bad stuff, but actually arguments about income equality and how do we take the country forward. So I want to introduce Emmanuel Saez, who is the Morris Cox Professor of Economics. His research focuses on tax policy and inequality, both from the theoretical and empirical perspectives. And jointly with Thomas Piketty, who you've probably all heard of, he's constructed long-run historical series of income equality in the United States that have been widely discussed in public debate. He has his PhD in economics from MIT. He's awarded the John Bates Clark Medal of the American Economic Association, and he also has a MacArthur Fellowship, which is otherwise every year known as the MacArthur Genius Awards, and Professor Saez is one of those. So without further ado, Professor Saez.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here with you this afternoon to tell you a little bit about my research on inequality and opportunity in the United States. And today I'm going to talk about very recent work that I've been doing with colleagues here at Berkeley and at other institutions on intergenerational mobility. That is, how does the income of the parents influence the kids' economic success. So the US is traditionally hailed as a land of opportunity where the chances of succeeding do not depend too heavily on parents' income. And so what we set out to examine is whether this reputation is empirically accurate. And so we study intergenerational mobility in the US using a great resource, which is the full population administrative tax data that records very well the incomes for pretty much everybody in the country. And we find actually substantial variation in intergenerational mobility within the United States in ways I will describe. So I will start showing you some national statistics, then describe the geographical variation in intergenerational mobility, and then try to explain why are places so different in intergenerational mobility across the United States. So, as I said, we use US individual income tax data that provides very rich information, not only on income, but also on things like college attendance, because there are credits for college attendance that are administered through the tax system. Also, things, family outcomes like teenage birth, because you record your dependents on your tax return. And so when I'm going to talk about intergenerational mobility, I'm going to look at children born in the United States from 1980 to 1982. So this is a cohort that today is in its mid-30s, and so we need an old cohort like that so that we can look at their outcomes in adult life. And so our study is based on about 10 million children based on those three cohorts. So we are going to measure parent income as the family income of the parents over 5 years, essentially when the kids were teenagers, that is in the mid-1990s. And then we follow the children and we look at their income in recent years, 2000, 2011, 2012. Think about the kids as being in their early 30s. And so we are going to look at intergenerational mobility. We're going to rank children based on their incomes relative to other children in the same birth cohort. So if you're in the top 10% of kids, that means relative to the other children in your cohort, not the full US population. And similarly, we rank parents relative to other parents of these cohorts. So let me show you a first result that is pretty striking. So here we rank parents by percentile. So here you have the lowest income parents, and here you have the highest income parents. And so for each of those percentiles, we calculate the average percentile of the children. So you can see that for children born from low income, growing up in low income families, they reach a percentile rank on average 30. While children born or growing up in very high income families reach a rank of about 65, so that the slope here is 0.34. That is, growing up in a high income family gives you, of course, later in life, a significant advantage of 34 percentile points. And so what is beautiful in this graph is that you can see that it's very close to a straight line thanks to the very large data set we are using. The second thing I want to show you is that this link, so is this slope big or large? I mean, it's not, it's definitely positive, so that is parental income matters. At the same time, it's much lower than 1. That is, it's not a one-to-one mapping from parents to income, so there is some mobility. And so to understand the mechanism, what we look at now is we again rank parents by percentiles as before, and now we show you the percent of kids who attend any college between the age of 18 and 21. And so you can see that there is actually an enormous gradient here. That is, kids from low-income families have only about a 25% chance of attending college in those ages, while kids from high-income families have a 90% plus chance of attending college. So you can see that the difference in parents first affects the likelihood of attending college, so it's not surprising that then later in life it affects the earnings, because earnings depend very heavily on the quality of the education you get. So it also shows you that those differences in economic success emerge relatively early in life. That is, by the time the kids are 18 to 20, there is already a huge difference. Similarly, another outcome that is very important from a socioeconomic perspective is the likelihood of a teenage birth for women, for the children when they are in their teenage age. And you can see there as well a very significant gradient where basically women growing up in high-income families have a zero probability of having a kid in their teenage years, while for low-income, for women growing up in low-income families, it's about 30%. And having a kid so early in life, of course, has a large, actually negative impact on your likelihood, to succeed economically. Now, how does the United States compare with other countries? So here in this graph, I show you in gray the first chart that we've seen for the United States. That is the parent income rank versus the child income rank. And in blue, I show you data from a country, a European country, Denmark, that is known for having a very equal society. Okay, so there is very little inequality in Denmark, but it turns out that there is also a lot more economic mobility in Denmark, because the role of parental income is less. That is, in Denmark, growing up in a high-income family gives you only an 18% advantage versus growing up in a low-income family. You can see that the slope is only about half of the slope for the United States. So it is not true that the United States has necessarily, more economic mobility than other countries. So to see that, here is a very simple way to measure intergenerational mobility, what we could call, the American dream. It's the probability that a child born to parents in the bottom fifth, the bottom 20% of the income distribution, reaches the top 20% of the income distribution. So think about it as being born poor, but making it, in the upper middle class, the top 20%. So in the United States, it's only 7.5%. In the UK, it would be 9%. In Denmark, 12%. You've seen indeed that there is much more intergenerational mobility. And in Canada, a country, very similar in many ways to the United States, it's an astonishing 13.5%. So from those comparisons, systematic comparisons of data, it does appear that the United States is a country of relatively low income mobility. So the next thing I want to mention is that the degree of income mobility in the United States measured by these type of measures or the rank slope has not changed that much over time. That is, the advantage of being born in a high-income family versus a low-income family has been similar in terms of how many ranks in the ladder of the income distribution it allows you to get further up. However, the reason why intergenerational mobility is so important, it's because US income inequality in the cross-section, as we all know, has increased dramatically. So indeed, I have done studies with Thomas Piketty showing a very large increase in income concentration in the United States since the 1980s. And so that matters a lot for how we are going to interpret those intergenerational mobility numbers, because in a society with a lot of inequality, the consequences of the birth lottery are larger than in a society with very equal outcomes. If everybody has almost the same income, it doesn't matter too much where you are in the distribution. While if there is a very wide range of incomes between the top and the bottom, then moving up the ranks makes a very large difference for your economic resources. So, after having showed you those US level numbers, I'm going to show you some results about geographical variation within the United States. So we're going to study geographical variation at the level of the commuting zone. You can think about it as a metro area, but it covers the full United States, and those are large metro areas. So for the case of the Bay Area, it really includes San Francisco, Oakland, San Jose as a single metro area. And so what we do is that we divide children into locations based on where they grew up, meaning we permanently assign the child to the commuting zone, no matter where she lives now. So it's the place you grew up, and in every commuting zone, we are going to measure parent and child incomes using rank in the national income distribution, so that when we talk about low-income people in San Francisco versus low-income people, say, in Charlotte, North Carolina, we're talking about the same income levels. And so I just want to give you, at the local level, an example. So this is Salt Lake City, where we repeat the type of graph where we put the rank of the parents versus the rank of the children. And just to contrast this with another place, this is Charlotte, North Carolina. So what you can see here is that in Salt Lake City, being born to rich parents versus Charlotte doesn't make much of a difference. The kids growing up in high-income families in Charlotte versus Salt Lake City will have about the same economic success on average. In contrast, it makes a huge difference to be born in a low-income parent. You can see that the kids in Salt Lake City in blue do a lot better than the kids in Charlotte, North Carolina. And so this example is actually fairly common. That is, across the United States, typically being born if you are born in a high-income family, where you grow up doesn't make a huge difference for your economic success. But being born in a low-income family is going to make a very big difference. And so the way we measure how well each place is doing is by measuring how children born among bottom 50% parents, so the first half of this graph here, do on average. And you can see that for Charlotte, they reach on average a rank 36, while they reach a rank 46 in Salt Lake. That is, in Salt Lake, they'll do almost as well as average. A rank of 46 is not far from the average of 50, while in Charlotte, they will be significantly poorer. So in terms of income, it would be, the difference between an income of 30,000 versus 23,000 as people, in their early 30s, which is very significant. So I can show you now a geographical map of the United States that measures how well the children are doing. Those children growing up in bottom 50% families. And so red is bad, meaning that those are low scores, and the lighter areas are much higher scores. And you can see, so there is quite a bit of variation in the United States, with basically the Southeast doing very poorly. So I gave you the example of Charlotte, the East Coast and the West Coast doing pretty well, and the best areas being actually kind of the rural West. So to make things perhaps more concrete, you can use an alternative measure, which is the likelihood of reaching the top 20% if you come from the bottom 20%, as I've shown you, across the countries. And so you can see that across the United States, you have again wide variation using again a color scale. In a place like Atlanta or Charlotte, the likelihood of reaching the top 20% if you come from the bottom 20% is only 4.5%. So an extremely low level that you wouldn't find in any actually advanced economy. So you really would have to go to a developing countries to find such low rates of income mobilities. In contrast, other cities, like think about San Jose, and that would be true as well for the Bay Area, San Francisco, Salt Lake City, you have numbers that are more than twice as high, 11% or 13% actually for San Jose, which is the best in the country for the big metro areas. And so you can see that numbers like in Salt Lake City or San Jose are comparable to the numbers we had, for Canada or Denmark. While numbers, for Charlotte and Atlanta are worse than any developed economy. So what this chart shows you essentially is that is the United States a land of opportunity? Doesn't have a single answer. Some places are, like think about Salt Lake City or San Jose. Other places definitely are not. So I want to point out that, again, among the best cities, you do find cities actually in California here, the San Francisco, San Diego, San Jose are very good with they have high numbers of the likelihood of reaching the top 20% if you come from the bottom 20%. But you also find some cities in New York, Salt Lake City, Pittsburgh, and some cities in Minneapolis. In contrast, for the worst cities, you typically find them in the southeast, in the south, and some old Rust Belt cities like Indianapolis, Detroit, or Columbus, Ohio. Those are the worst 10 among the top 50 cities in the United States. So what this data has allowed us to discover is that intergenerational mobility varies really widely across cities. And what is interesting is that because you have such good quality data, essentially, the full population, you can really dive into local areas as well. So just for you, I wanted to show you a very local charts of the counties in the Bay Area and how do they do in terms of probability of reaching the top 20%, starting from the bottom 20%. So all those numbers are pretty good in the sense that they are 10 or above. But what I want to point out is that even within a small area like this, there are actually pretty big differences. So for example, you can see San Francisco and Marin County have very good numbers, where a kid growing up in the bottom 20% would have almost 20% chance of reaching the top 20%, which is actually truly excellent. You know, it's almost as good as the average, regardless of your parental income. In contrast, in counties that are pretty close, you know, like Alameda County here, you know, it would be only 11%. So take two kids, you know, one growing up in Marin, one in Alameda, from low-income families. The families have the same income. Their chances of success are actually quite different. So, given those striking results, I want to show you a little bit what sort of factors can explain or at least correlate with those results. That is, what is it about some of those places that makes them so successful at having high levels of intergenerational mobility. So I'm going to focus on hypotheses that have been proposed in the sociology and economics literature and in the public debate. So those are not going to give us the full causal mechanisms, but they are going to help us guide the search, you know, for what are the true causal mechanisms. So remember, what I had shown you early on is that college and teenage birth is very related to parental income, and it is true as well that there is a lot of spatial variation in this college attendance gradient or this teenage birth gradient. Namely, that places that have high levels of upward mobility tend to have relatively high levels of college attendance for low-income kids, and conversely, relatively low levels of teenage births for women for low-income kids. So it's not just the job opportunities for the children. Things happen even before the children really start on the job market, namely, you know, where they can go to school, and what happens to their own family situation. Do they have children really early in their life? So let me move on and think about factors that affect upward mobility. So the first one, when you looked at that chart showing you that the Southeast was doing so poorly in terms of intergenerational mobility, Atlanta, Charlotte, you imagine, you very quickly think about places with large African-American populations. And indeed, you would think, yes, it's very well known that the African-American community is not doing very well economically, and that kids, black kids growing up in low-income families are not going to do very well. So it is true that areas with large African-American populations have less upward mobility. So you can see it in this very simple chart that plots the fraction black in the city versus a measure of upward mobility, and it's strongly declining. But what is interesting in what we found is that white Americans also have lower rates of upward mobility in areas with a large African American share, which means that it's not so much the fact of being black that lowers, you know, intergenerational mobility, although there is a factor here. It's something about the area. It turns out that perhaps, you know, the consequences of American history, cities with very large African-American populations are just not good at upward mobility, and that's true for blacks living there, but also for whites living there. And so you can think that those cities differ from other cities in the sense that they have more racial and income segregation. And we also find that racial and income segregation is very strongly correlated with low levels of intergenerational mobility. So just to give you an example here, so that's a depiction of Atlanta and showing you by colors the various populations. So you have the whites in blue and the blacks in green, and so you can see very clearly, that there is blue on top and white at the bottom. Atlanta is the type of city that is very segregated by race. In contrast, Sacramento, same coloring, you can see that the colors are actually mixed up. That is, the whites in blue have significant subpopulation, of Asians in red and of blacks to some extent here. So it's a city with much less segregation, and that measure of segregation plays a large role. That is, if you do an index of segregation in the city and upward mobility, you do find a very strong downward sloping curve. So we think that the mechanism here is that places that have a lot of segregation basically concentrate poverty or disadvantaged communities, and perhaps if you grow up in a neighborhood where most families are poor, you have fewer role models, or you have fewer opportunities to learn from more fortunate families. What are the ways to succeed economically? That is, how to work well in school, how to apply for colleges, etc. So coming back to income inequality is the second big factor I want to emphasize. So here, in this chart, I contrast, Salt Lake City that has relatively a large middle class or low inequality versus Atlanta that has actually a small middle class, and Salt Lake City is much more mobile intergenerationally than Atlanta. And so this curve here shows you the measure of inequality in the city versus the level of upward mobility. So this one shows you that places that are more unequal have less intergenerational mobility. So this relationship that we find here across US cities is very strong, and this curve has been done across countries. Where it's known as the Great Gatsby curve, namely, countries that have high levels of inequality. So think about developing countries, South America, tend to be those countries that have low levels of intergenerational mobility. That is, you grow up poor, it's hard for you to reach to succeed economically. And so that phenomenon seems also to be true across the United States cities. And so an explanation for that, it could be related to the segregation of the city. That is, when you have a lot of inequality, the rich and poor are typically not going to be able to live in the same neighborhood. That is, poor families are not going to be able to afford living where wealthier families are, and so it reduces the number, perhaps, of interactions between the social strata, and it makes it harder for the low-income people to succeed economically. Another one that's highly correlated with intergenerational mobility is family structure. So if you measure in each city the share of families that are single parents versus married parents, you find that in places like San Francisco that has a relatively low level of single parents, about 20%, those places will be more, will have more upward mobility than places like New Orleans, where the share of single parents is 31%. And interestingly, in that case as well, it's not, obviously growing up in a single parent family is a disadvantage because your family is likely to have less income than if you have two parents. But what is interesting in our findings is that even if you restrict yourself to kids growing up in married families, we find that kids in married families who grow up in places like New Orleans that have a lot of single parents tend to not do as well as kids growing up in places like San Francisco. So it's not just the mechanical effect of growing up in a single parent family, it's a marker of the place that places that have lots of single parent families tend to be dysfunctional in ways, that also limit the economic success of kids who happen to grow up in a married family. And so the last factor I want to emphasize is social capital. So how do you measure social capital? Sociologists have proposed a number of indexes such as fraction of people voting, fraction of people participating, in various community societies. So the big one here being participating, in church activities. And we find that social capital is also very strongly related to upward mobility. So to just give you an example on this chart, Pittsburgh, that has a very high share religious, is much more mobile than, say, Orlando, that has a smaller share religious. But that relationship is true throughout. Another very good example of that is Salt Lake City, that is a very mobile city and is known, with the Mormon Church to have very strong communities, and possibly social capital helps, those type of organization help bring together people from different incomes, and low-income people can learn from their peers about how to succeed economically. So yes, no, and so the very last one I want to mention, which is important here for people who support, the quality of schools, is school quality as well. So you can measure K-12 school quality. A very simple measure is how well the kids do on their test at grades, 3 to 8. So there is systematic data on this in the United States, and we do find as well that cities that tend to have better schools have more upward mobilities than cities with lower quality schools. So to summarize, the 5 characteristics of high mobility areas tend to be less residential segregation, larger middle class or less inequality if you want, places with more two-parent family structures, greater social capital, and better school quality. So this is the study we did, just to show you a preview of current work that I'm actually working on. Today we are continuing using this data to explore more specifically the role of higher education in intergenerational mobility. Meaning that with this text data, you know where people are going to school. And so you can see the kids, with their parents when they attend school or before they attend school. You can follow the kids and see what happens to them. So we hope to construct a database of parental income and student income, institution by institution. So we'll be able to say at UC Berkeley, kids come from families of that type. That many come from top 20% families, that many, from low-income families. And once 10 years after or 15 years after, the kids hear where they are in the income distribution. And just to give you a preview, I want to contrast, based on this data, 2 types of elite institutions. So in blue, you have the highly selective public schools. So UC Berkeley would be a great example of that. And in orange, the highly selective private schools. So think about the Stanfords and Harvards. And so what this chart shows you is that at these two types of school, what are the parents' income? And so you can see that in the private schools, you have 2/3 of kids come from top 20% families, and very few come from families, in the bottom quintiles. At elite public schools, there is still inequality in the sense that you have 40% coming from the top 20%, but you can see that it's a more even distribution with significant numbers coming from the bottom quintiles. So this is for the parents. Now, how are the kids doing? And so here I add to that chart the fraction of kids reaching themselves, the top 20%, given the parent income they come from. And so you can see that because those are great schools, even if you come from a low-income family, you have a 40% chance of reaching the top 20%, of doing very well. That is, you are a low-income kid, you go to Berkeley or you go to Stanford, you are yourself actually pretty likely to do very well. But so what is interesting in that chart is that the first thing is that those two types of schools have similar outcomes in terms of likelihood of reaching the top 20%. There's not a huge difference between, if you want, the Berkeleys versus the Stanford. So that's true because it's a relatively big group. The top 20%, that's upper middle class success. If you were to look at really striking it rich, actually you would see that the privates are better. But in this pretty broad measure of success, they are doing pretty well. And the second really striking thing is that you can see that the slope of those two lines is actually very low, meaning that the kids from low-income parents can succeed with a 40% chance. The kids from high-income parents succeed, with a 50% chance. But the difference is actually very small. In sharp contrast, with the charts I've shown you, when you don't condition where you go to school. So there is hope in a chart like this one, in the sense that it shows you that if you manage to put more low-income kids to the good schools, you are going to increase upward mobility, because those kids do actually pretty well once they get into a good schools. And the second thing that is striking in this one is that different schools are going to contribute very differently in levels, in terms of upward mobility. So public schools, elite public schools, which still take a significant number of low-income kids, are going to be much bigger contributors of upward mobility than elite schools, private schools that take actually a very slim number of low-income students. So this is a big debate in higher education. How do you improve access? And it will be a continuing debate, and we hope that our numbers can be there to illuminate this debate. Thank you very much.
So we have time for a few questions, and Melanie and Rebecca from the Gift Planning team are going to help. I wanted to start off because I want to ask a question. IRS data you're looking at, just to be clear for everyone here, it's aggregate data, right? That's what you get from the IRS?
Yes. So the way it works is that, the IRS, of course, maintains, the database for its operation, and they've developed a program for researchers, where researchers like myself, and others at other universities can go to IRS offices. So here, it's the federal building in Oakland, where we can work on the tax data. So when we work on the tax data, it's already data that has been scrubbed, of names, etc. So we just see, income records and scrambled social security numbers, but there we work directly with the individual tax data, and then Of course, we take out results that are like this, aggregated results. There are very strong, regulations to protect, taxpayer confidentiality, that you're not going to take a one-person data, but still it's an incredible resource to produce good empirical economic research.
And then when you look at things like race or social characteristics, you're getting other data sources, and where do you get those?
Sometimes, yes, so race specifically, you cannot get it from the tax data. So I haven't gone into the detail, but there, yes, you have to merge that to census, local census tracts, or zip codes, to estimate, the fraction, say, black in each country. But for many outcomes, like as the family, how many kids are there in the family? Do you have a teenage mother? Where do you go to college? That's already in the tax data.
Questions out there? Here's one.
I noticed that in the years that you took the data from the parents, that was in a tremendous boom time, right? Before the Y2K issues.
Yes.
And in the years that you took the 30 and 31, that was still a period of difficulty. And I'm wondering if that, how that impacted the variations that you might have seen, knowing that generally, one assumes that generally well-to-do and well-educated people in boom times figure out how to make it work for them even when there's a bust, whereas lower income and lower educated might have more difficulty with that.
Yeah, no, this is a very good question. It's true that places, if the boom and the recession were the same everywhere in the US, it wouldn't matter because all incomes, go up or down. But it's true that places are affected differentially by booms and busts. So the late 90s were particularly good in the Bay Area, the dot-com boom. The Great Recession hit harder, some places like Florida or Nevada. So we've done actually a bunch of robustness checks, where we select different years, different definition of incomes, and the overall big picture about which places have more mobility than others is actually pretty robust. That is, the Southeast looks bad, no matter what sort of income definition you use. But this is indeed an interesting thing to explore.
Rebecca, over there.
Oh, thank you.
Wait, no, sorry. There's somebody with a microphone back there.
Thank you. So, my question is, what's so important about being in the top 20%? I mean, and what's the 20% income look like that we're supposed to be succeeding at? Having gone to Stanford, I understand this a little bit.
Yes.
And being from a low-income family, I'm not really aspiring to being in the top 20%.
Yes, it's true. For rarefied audiences, the top 20% is not an impressive group, because for parents, it'd be parents with, roughly speaking, more than $180,000. So, it's a solid upper middle class. For kids in their early 30s, it's a much lower level. So I think the top 20% would be something like $90,000 of family income. I mean, I'm telling you rough numbers, rough orders of magnitude. It's still a good measure of economic success, if you are thinking population-wide. That is, you grow up poor, meaning, in a family with less than $30,000 in annual income, being able to get to the top 20% is a significant achievement. Now, it's true that when you look at very elite schools, you want to go further beyond, the top 20%, and I just told you very briefly, but it's true if you were to look at reaching now the top 1%, 500K in annual income, the private schools would look the elite private schools would look better, than the elite public schools. So we hope actually when we put together these data to have indeed also statistics about the smaller groups, within the top 20%.
Okay, Melanie, over here.
There's a popular cultural narrative in America that the 1950s was a golden time, a happy days time. And in the current political election, people are appealing to that, at least one candidate saying, let's go back. But your statistics suggested that there wasn't a great variation between 1950 and 1971. Yes. Second element, if you look at Montana, Idaho, and Utah, those are basically white states. There are very few black people or poor people of color who live in those states. So their median income is going to look different. In fact, if you look at San Francisco and Marin County and compare that to Alameda County or Contra Costa County, those are also dramatically different, aren't they?
Yeah, so let me start with the second question. That's why when we compare counties, so think about Alameda versus San Francisco, when we say bottom 20%, it's bottom 20% in the US national income distribution, which would be, as I quoted the number, I think maybe 25,000. So it's really looking at kids with less than $25,000 in Alameda and kids with less than $25,000 in San Francisco. So you have to think about them as kids who have the same dollars when they grow up, knowing that it's true in San Francisco, they will look really, really poor. There aren't many of them, while in Alameda, it's a more common economic situation. We thought that was the most rational thing to do. So on the 1950s, so here, that's why, yes, let me re-express that because it is very important. Intergenerational mobility measured by those likelihood of moving from the bottom 20% to top 20% were about the same, to the best data we have. But the big difference is that in the 1950s, inequality cross-sectional was much lower. So there wasn't as big of a difference between the bottom 20% and the top 20%. So in some sense, the lack of mobility didn't matter as much. It didn't make as much of a difference, a contrast, if you want, in the feeling that people had about their economic success. But what I also want to say is that it's true overall inequality has increased a lot, but along some specific dimension like gender equality, we've seen a lot of progress in the good direction with the gender gap having gone down substantially. It's not yet at zero, far from it, but it's improved. But overall, if you sum all sources of inequality, it's true. We have more inequality today than in the 1950s.
Anybody in the back 20% of the seats? Or middle 20%? Anybody back there? I want to make sure you're not ignored back there. Okay, there's a question way over there in the back.
Have you looked at mobility for immigrant groups and their children?
Yes, no, so that's a very good question. We suspect that their mobility rates are much higher. Unfortunately, in the tax data, we don't see very well immigration status because the tax data, compiled in a systematic way starts actually in the mid-1990s. So you don't really see when the parents, say, enter the United States. You don't have race either, but the hope is that as this data accumulates in the future, people will be able to look specifically at new parent entrants and see what is their contribution to mobility, and I believe it is large.
Okay, another one over here.
Yes, this graph is very interesting. And the mobility report card certainly suggests that the American dream is a reality, or at least a possible reality, for the public schools, whereas less so for the private schools. And I sort of wonder, the public schools around the country, the colleges and universities, have been increasing their tuition rather sharply as state houses don't have the same resources they devoted before. Certainly in California, that's been the case. And I sort of wonder, do you see those two? Do you see the advantage of the public schools receding as public school tuition continues to grow?
Yes, I mean, that is certainly a risk, because to get low-income kids to good schools, you will have, as a government, as a community, or as an institutions, to pay, to subsidize, a significant fraction. It's not going to work solely, through the private market and the student loans. And so what I want to say, when you mention state houses don't have the resources, I call that a community choice. That is, Californians, through their elected officials, have decided that they want to put, a smaller fraction of taxes, state and local taxes toward universities. So perhaps because, in the political debate, you have to do a budget, you're always short, and you cut what you can without thinking necessarily that much about all the long run consequences. And so on the positive side, the benefit of good public institution is the fact that they are the type of institutions who can really get a lot of kids from low-income families and give them, a good education and hence a good economic outcome. So that's why putting those data together helps the debate and helps people, remember the value.
We can take one more. We got any over here? Right there? Okay, we'll have to make it quick. Oh, I got a little surprise for you, so I want to make sure we...
Hi, you referred to causal mechanisms in one of your slides. So do you do causal modeling?
So, yes, so here I've shown you only correlations, but what indeed economists are interested in are more causal mechanisms, namely, to be very precise, if we gave more money to the University of California, what would happen to those numbers? Or when the big private schools decided to cut significantly the tuition for low-income kids, did they manage to enroll, more kids from low-income studies? So those are very interesting questions, and we economists are doing them, and we will be doing them here. But today it was descriptive, not causal effects.
Okay. So I want to thank Professor Saez for his lecture today. He will be joining us at the tea, so thank you very much.
Thank you.
And he will be joining us at the tea if you have any individual questions. The tea is over at the Pauley Ballroom, and I have a little surprise, so if you'll quickly get up and make your way over there as quick as you can. On the outside, we have a little surprise for you on your way there. Thank you.